previous video, we began discussing one of the 10 question types, referred to as detail questions. In this video, we will examine the inference questions, while also exploring the importance of signal words and the role that they play in the reading process. As mentioned before, there are 10 question types on the TOEFL. In this video, we're going to look at inferences, or referred to as questions type 3 and 4. Once again, we'll be using the information provided to us by ETS. The download information can be found below this video. And please, once again, make sure that you've read through and skimmed the entire passage before proceeding with this video. Now, let's start by talking about what making an inference really is. So in real life, we often think about making inferences, which is kind of similar to the idea of making a logical guess, and this is based on available information that helps us to kind of draw a conclusion about something. But as you will see, making an inference on the TOEFL will be a little bit different from making one in real life. So first off, to think about inferences in general, making inferences, we need to kind of consider what we can and can't infer when it comes to talking about information. So for example, let's look at two different situations. So in the first example, what could we infer? Your friend walks in the door with a raincoat on and an umbrella in hand, and there are water droplets all over his clothes. What can we logically conclude here? Now on the right side, here's another situation. Your friend has the keys to his car in his hand and is going out the door. Where is he going? Now, the first problem we recognize here is that we could infer, we do have enough information to probably conclude that it's raining outside. So on a test such as the TOEFL, that would be a logical assumption. That's something that you could make because you have plenty of evidence. But on the right side, in real life, we could probably infer lots of things, especially if we knew the person. But on a test such as the TOEFL, we really can't answer that question because there are just too many possibilities. We know that he's going somewhere in his car, but we don't know where specifically. So in this case on the TOEFL, there's not enough information. So this would not be considered a TOEFL-like question or situation. So in that car example, as we mentioned before, we could come up with all kinds of answers and even opinions, any of which could be right. But that would never happen on a test such as the TOEFL. So the problem here is we would need to find something in the text that would indicate where the person likes to go. So that kind of gives us a brief introduction to making an inference on the test. So we're going to look at question type number 3. Now question type number 3 generally is just referring to the idea of making an inference. And most of the time that means making a conclusion based on information we see in the text. So these types of questions, though, can be used with any of the following language, such as it is likely that, or possible that, or it can be inferred. We also might see questions such as it is suggested. Any of those particular words can indicate that we're trying to draw a conclusion based on the information. Now we're looking again at the passage number 1, that Rise of Teotihuacan. So as we look at the questions that follow the reading passage, can you identify which ones we would consider to be inference-type questions? So looking at the questions, and again there are 14 of them, 13 of which we really are going to pay attention to right now, which one or ones seem to be involved with the idea of inferring information? So take a look at the questions. Well, in this case, we're looking at questions number 6 and 7. So, let's break them down. Let's start with question 6. Which of the following pieces of information can be inferred from paragraphs 2 and 3 about the volcanic eruptions of the late 1st millennium BC? Now, how are we going to tackle this question? Well, the first thing we need to think about is where in these paragraphs does it actually talk about volcanic eruptions or something similar to them. So again, we're going to scan for information to see if we can figure out where to read. Now, the question mentions paragraph 2. So let's start with paragraph 2 and begin to think about where do we look. So let's scan. Where are we going to find that information? Well, in order to do that, we're probably going to see how signal words are going to help play a role in understanding this. Now we're going to go ahead and look at the idea of signal words for just a moment before returning to the reading passage and think about their role in helping us improve the reading comprehension process. Now first off, signal words, we kind of referred to them in our first video, but let's talk about them more in detail here. Signal words involve a broad variety of words that help signal or indicate what you are about to read, or how that information connects to information before or after it. Signal words can work on many levels. They can help work to connect sentences together. They can even be inside of a sentence to connect information together. They may even be used between paragraphs to connect paragraphs together. Now here are just some examples of signal words. There's a more complete list that we're going to see below the video here. But some of those signal words kind of belong to certain categories. So we have those signal words which tell us something about the sequence of the information. So for example, words such as first or then. We have those signals that help indicate sort of an illustration or example. So words such as for example or such as. We have words or phrases that often give us a definition, which is something that we might see on the TOEFL. So these types of signals might be, for example, this is called or this is known as. The next one is referring to cause and effect. So this could be something that is the result of something else. And then another category would be comparing and contrasting information. So information that might be different, such as on the contrary, or information that we might see that is indicated with on the other hand. Now this is not a complete list or a complete list of all the categories, and you will notice that different resources refer to signal words in different ways. So this is just kind of a brief overview of the ideas. Now again, locating signal words, the good news is that oftentimes we can look in typical places. For example, signal words are often at the beginning of sentences, followed by commas. For example, first, comma, the doctor wanted. We can also find them in the middle of sentences. They're often separated by a comma or even a semicolon. He said, comma, but she thought. He said, semicolon, however, she thought. Now, of course, these two sentences are a little bit different, but again, they kind of indicate that we can find them in the middle. And of course, we can also find those signal words at the beginning or near the end of paragraphs. So really, we can find signal words in many places, but they often are found in these three areas the most consistently. Now, one thing that signal words really help to do is to identify just how the academic information is organized. On the TOEFL, all of the readings are academic in nature, so that's something we mentioned in the very first video of this series. But we have to keep in mind that each type of reading may often have a different organizational pattern. Now we're going to look at that a little more carefully in our example today. So pay attention to see how the signal words might tell us how we can understand the organization, and that might help us find the answers to these questions a little more quickly. Now, all of this reflects a very important process, and this is the idea of active reading. This is something we're going to refer to a lot throughout the rest of this video series. As the questions get a little more complicated, we have to really understand what we are comprehending. So active reading really involves the following ideas. Well, again, we talked already about understanding organization. So, for example, understanding how signal words work, and maybe we need to think about when we read, we can kind of reorganize information or reorder it so that we can understand the connections between ideas a little more easily. So that's the idea. We move information around to better understand those connections in sequence. Some signal words are often confusing, so I tell students to reorder a sentence, and maybe that helps make it a little more clear. So sometimes signal words, we think about words like because or although. Those words oftentimes are confusing when we see them at the beginning of a sentence. So often I tell students to reorganize them. Another idea that we should do when we're reading is called paraphrasing. Now, paraphrasing is basically the act of using similar or synonymous language, kind of expressed in our own words, of the text that we're reading. This often helps us become more involved with the reading, and it also most likely will help us understand it better instead of just using the words that the text is telling us. Another idea of paraphrasing, though, is also making sure as we're going along to probably eliminate information that may not be necessary. Now, some sentences may have lots of important pieces of information. Other sentences may have only one or two pieces of information, and the rest we can kind of eliminate while we're reading at the time. A lot will depend on what the question is asking us to do. So, for example, as we begin this process, we're going to see how we can use active reading in our example here, because we're going to need to read a little bit more in order to answer this question. So first off, you will notice that I'm kind of removing some information from paragraph 2 that does not seem to be referring to the idea of these volcanoes. So first off, it is talking about the idea of these factors. Well, which factors are we talking about, and what role do they play? Well, as I scan through, I kind of skim through the information, I can see religious significance, talking about historical information. I do see talking about the concept of the Teotihuacan elite, which were, again, those people who are at the top of society. And then finally, I notice here at the bottom, does it mention something about these natural disasters, which is basically the same thing as saying these volcanic eruptions. And we see it right here at the end of the paragraph. So notice, in this case, if I think about what's the only information that refers to the idea of the volcanic eruptions? Well, the beginning of the paragraph really is talking about those factors that are playing a part. And it seems like that one of the factors is at the end of the paragraph, the volcanic eruptions. So really, for this part of the reading, we don't really need all of paragraph 2 at all. And in fact, we see already that word finally, that signal word, which again is located at the end of the sentence, the end of the paragraph rather, really helps to identify that it's the end of paragraph 2 that's probably going to help us connect to paragraph 3. And if I notice, look at the language I see immediately at the beginning of paragraph 3. It says, this last factor. Well, this is a referent word. It's referring to something probably before it. Well, in this case, we see the word factor here and factors here. So it's clear at this point that really only the second part of this, or the last part of the paragraph, really is the only part we have to pay attention to. And even then, paragraph 2 is only talking about the fact that natural disasters had some kind of impact, and that impact is often difficult to understand. Why was that impact important? So already paragraph 2, we've done quite a bit of eliminating to see, as I'm going through in this active process, really the goal here is that it's going to connect to most of paragraph 3. So notice how that's what it's talking about. And that this last factor is somewhat connected to the rise of Teotihuacan. Now that we've gotten to paragraph 3, now we're going to get really active. Now how are we going to do this? Well, as we focus on paragraph 3, let's see if we can try to understand the organization of the paragraph first. Well, that means probably skimming through and trying to identify the signals that we see. So as we skim through, let's see if we can recognize some of these signals that indicate how the information is organized. Take a moment and look through it. Well, as we skim through, we begin to notice that this text seems to have a lot of dates and time-related signals. For example, I notice prior to 200 BC, or around this time. This time, of course, is probably referring to the same signal before it, with this place eliminated as arrival. So it sounds like something happened first, and then something happened next. Of course, there are other signals too. Again, this beginning of the paragraph, this last factor, we've already talked about, that it was connecting to the information in paragraph 2, that it's talking about volcanic eruptions. And then notice at the end, I do see another time signal by the 1st century AD. So it seems like we've moved from before 200 BC to about almost up to 100 AD, which is another way of saying 1st century. So really, we're going to have to pay attention to all of the paragraph. Now, of course, we need to think about how is the paragraph organized. Well, what can that tell us? Well, these particular signal words, how can they indicate that organization? Well, let's think for a moment. These signals, a lot of these signals, appear to be what we would call time signals. They give us some kind of a period of time in which we're reading. Well, think for a moment. What kind of academic reading is organized in this way? Now, again, if you're somewhat familiar with the TOEFL, you know that the TOEFL covers areas involving science, geology, English language, perhaps, humanities related, and so on. But think for a moment, what kind of academic reading will we find to be organized in this particular way? Well, if you said a history text or something similar, you probably are correct. That's because history readings are often organized in these what we call chronological order. Chronological order involves using time words and expressions to indicate when certain events occurred. So again, we notice, for example, prior to 200 BC. That gives us a sort of a time frame. Sometimes we also see sequence signals, and these are often fairly common as well, because historical events often occur one after the other. Well, again, we mentioned that even that little expression with this particular place eliminated, it sounds like something happened before it, and that something is coming after it. So again, this could be a type of sequence signal that maybe we didn't think about at first when we saw the text the first time. Now, how is this going to help us? Well, part of the idea of actively reading, like we mentioned before, is that we want to maybe reorder information and maybe even paraphrase information so that we can understand it better in our own words. Well, again, hopefully you've already skimmed through the paragraph, maybe even taken some time to read it a little more carefully. So on the left side, I have the original paragraph here. But on the right side, we're going to use our translation. Now, I mean translation, basically how we're paraphrasing the text. And remember, we're paraphrasing by focusing on the important ideas, removing ideas that maybe are not so important, and then expressing them in language that maybe we could understand better. So for example, I kind of changed the order. I started with the end and moved it to the beginning. Because first off, we're talking about what have volcanic eruptions done. So in this case, we talk about that there's evidence that shows that Teotihuacan became this power around 100 AD. And if you remember from the question was talking about what role did the volcanic eruptions play in the rise of this city. So in this case, I'm starting with the last piece of information first because it's getting me a little more active in the reading. I'm paying more attention to it. So I'm kind of moving backwards. So other towns, other cities, now again I see that it's mentioned here, such as this city, which is called Quiquilco, had the opportunity to become a power, but did not become a political power. So again, I'm using kind of simpler language here that basically says the same thing. Now again, I'm moving back up. Because of a volcanic eruption, Quiquilco was no longer a threat to Teotihuacan's power. So again, we're just kind of summarizing some of the basic information we see so far. So if we understand this, Teotihuacan became the center of the power in the region, but other towns had opportunities, but for some reason they didn't. And most likely it's because a volcanic eruption prevented this city from threatening Teotihuacan's power. Now notice that this is a constantly dynamic process. So in other words, oftentimes I'm reordering and paraphrasing information constantly. That's because I want to get more involved with the text. So this was a situation where I purposely moved the last piece of information first so that I could get more involved with it. So keep in mind, you may be doing this process over and over again, ongoing, until you really completely understand the information. So again, I'm trying to get students to be more actively involved with the reading process instead of just starting at the beginning and moving to the end. Now, keep in mind, if you're a good reader, it's not required that you reorder and paraphrase the information, but notice now how much better we seem to understand it after we spent a little more time. So after we kind of translated it into our words and reorganized it, it does seem a little bit easier to understand. Teotihuacan is the power. It mentions that in the question. But the reason is because other cities suffered from these volcanic eruptions. So now let's return to the question. So, thinking about those volcanic eruptions again, what can we basically conclude based on the information we saw? Well, keep in mind that this particular situation oftentimes is what tricks students. Because many times students want to think about what's possible, but then what the question is looking for is something that we can prove in the text. So, oftentimes students think that just making an inference is determining what could possibly happen. But if you remember, making an inference on the TOEFL is something different. It involves looking at the text and drawing some kind of conclusion. And that is based on what we actually will see in the reading. But, fortunately, the TOEFL has given us some help. They have given us choices to eliminate. And oftentimes students think, oh, that's very helpful. But oftentimes we have to remember that in drawing conclusions, there could be more than one conclusion in real life. But on the test, we really can only make one choice. Remember, there's only one answer choice. So in this case, it would probably be too difficult for ETS to try to confuse you with all the possible conclusions. That would not be fair, I think, from the ETS's perspective. So here is the basic idea. The easiest and most direct way to find the answer is really to identify which answer choice contains basically the same language, those synonyms or synonymous information. And we'll demonstrate how that trick works here in our example. So again, as we look at the choices, let's try to eliminate those that are completely wrong. So we can go back to the text to verify if necessary. So as we're going back to the text, again, we're probably focusing mainly on this paragraph 3. But paragraph 2 might give us some help. Again, it does mention that the role of these factors is kind of difficult to understand. So first off, let's look at the answer choices. Well, first off, D might be possible. But if you notice, it's not referenced in any way in the text. They mention nothing about how irrigation played a part in the Teotihuacan Valley. So at this point, we're going to eliminate D. All right, now let's look at our 3 remaining choices. Is there another one that we could eliminate? Well, if we notice A, again, might be possible. Historians may have mentioned this before. But notice we don't actually see anything in the text talking about what historians are saying. The idea of historians the idea is not even mentioned. So at this point, I think we can eliminate A as well. So again, notice how the test is trying to trick you. It's trying to trick you with possible information, but not necessarily information you can prove. All right, now let's look at the 2 remaining choices. Now, the 2 remaining choices include some of the same language, but do they have the same language basically stated in the same way? Remember, one of the other tricks could be that they have some information that's stated, but they have some of the information wrong. Remember, the correct answer is going to have basically the same idea as what's stated in the text. And as we said before, one common trick on the test is to get some of that information wrong or in the wrong order. So again, looking back at the text, which ones are talking about those small towns, which piece of information, and then which one seems to be referring to the answer choice we see in C? Well, as we go back now to the choices, notice that one of the pieces of information we're looking at pretty much is at the end of the paragraph. The archaeological evidence clearly indicates, though, that Teotihuacan was the center that did arise. Okay, so now let's look at those answer choices one more time. Which choice seems to have the most similar wording with the wording in the text? Well, again, if I look at B, let's make sure that the information is correct. The earthquakes may have done more damage to Teotihuacan than to neighboring centers. Well, in our translation, remember, the volcanic eruption seemed to do damage to the other cities, not to Teotihuacan. If we look at C, we could see that they may have, and may would indicate that, again, that possibility, have played a major role in the rise of Teotihuacan. Well, in this case, it seems like B misrepresents the information, and C is the one that's most similar to the text that we see in paragraph 3. So this would be an example of where we could draw a conclusion, but really, if we notice, a lot of the similar words that we saw in the text are pretty much reflected in the question choice. Again, thinking about may, we saw that there were a lot of words that were a little bit uncertain. We said they could have played a possible role. And of course, major would be one that would be significant. So in this case, we could see that a lot of the word choices, and of course the rise is mentioned here too, a lot of answer choices, a lot of words here in the answer choice that seem to reflect the same language or similar language as in the text. Now let's move on to question 7. Now again, question 7 is somewhat helpful because it is talking more now about paragraph 3, a paragraph that we've already spent some time looking at. And it's also giving us an idea of where to look specifically. It's giving us that date, that prior to 200 BC. So at this point, we can go directly to the text to figure out where is it talking about this city before this time period. So as we go back to the text, we recognize that it's right here where we can begin to look for that information. So, as we look for this information, let's start in this particular sentence. Prior to 200 BC, a number of relatively small centers coexisted in and near the Valley of Mexico. So, a number of these smaller centers. Around this time, so again, the signal is telling me to continue reading. The largest of these centers, Cuicuilco, was seriously affected by a volcanic eruption. So again, we can kind of guess that around this time, so around 200 BC and before, this is when Cuicuilco was basically affected by the earthquake. So now let's look at our answer choices and think which ones can we begin to eliminate first. So first off, at A, it was a fairly small city until that date. In other words, until 200 BC, it was a fairly small city. Well, it does say that it's the largest of these centers, but that it was still part of a relatively small center, because it did mention these centers, so they are connected. So this is probably one we want to keep. It was located outside the Valley of Mexico. Well, again, if we look at the answer choice, it says that it was in and near. But we don't know necessarily if it was outside of the valley. This is not one that we can actually infer. It might be possible, but it does not state that in the text. So at this point, we can eliminate B. In C, it emerged rapidly as an economical and political center. So before 200 BC, could it have emerged rapidly as an economic and political center? Well, it definitely says it was the largest of these centers. And it does mention a little bit later about that any number of these towns might have emerged as a leading economic and political power. But if you recall, there is a sequence signal here. Cuicuilco was eliminated as a rival because of the volcanic eruption that happened before. So in this case, we probably can eliminate C. Finally, in D, its economy relied heavily on agriculture. Well, we do notice that Cuicuilco was seriously affected by the volcanic eruption, with much of its agricultural land covered by lava. Now, why do you think the text mentions the agricultural land? Well, again, we are talking about very old civilizations. So it's very possible that agriculture was very important to Quiquilco, and that the volcano before 200 BC, before the volcano actually hit, that agriculture was probably a pretty important part. It does say it was the largest of these centers. So let's keep that one as a possibility as well. So at this point, we've got two answer choices that seem fairly reasonable. But the question is, which one can we basically determine to be the answer choice here? So, which of the two seems to be more accurately reflected in the text? Well, as we go back and recognize, looking again at those signals, prior to 200 BC, a number of these small centers coexisted. Around this time, the largest of these centers, Quiquilco, was affected by the volcanic eruption. Now, the text mentions that it's a fairly small city, but it was a fairly small city until that date? In other words, did after that date something happen that made it bigger? Well, again, the text is only referring to the information of before 200 BC. We don't know necessarily after 200 BC did they become a bigger city or not, though we could probably guess that the city itself probably did suffer after that, because it did suffer from a volcanic eruption. But it did mention that it's the largest of these centers. So in this case, A is starting to look like it's not going to be the answer. If we go back to D, we can kind of guess that Quiquilco probably was an agricultural power. Because after the earthquake, Quiquilco essentially was eliminated as that potential rival. In other words, it no longer was a power, and was not going to challenge Teotihuacan as the center. So even though the two answer choices are not great choices to separate from, it does seem like D is the better answer choice between A and D. So again, notice here that when we're inferring information, this one is probably the closest to the actual language stated in the text, that it did have agricultural land, and that probably that's what affected its position. Okay, let's move on to the other question type, and that's inferring rhetorical purpose. Now, generally, the rhetorical purpose question is focusing on specifically why the author of the article may have used a particular wording or stated a particular fact. You can often identify these questions with the following wording. Why does the author state? Or what purpose does the author have? So notice oftentimes these are the questions that use the word author in them. So looking at our questions again, which one or one seems to be involving what the author's particular reason is or purpose? Well, in this case, the question we're going to be looking at is actually only one, question number 12. So let's look at it. In paragraph 6, the author discusses, quote, the thriving obsidian operation, end quote, in order to do something. So once again, the test is telling us to look specifically at a particular area, paragraph 6. And then the nice thing here too is it's even highlighted the thriving obsidian operation to tell us where exactly to begin looking. So as we scan through the text, we can see that it's highlighted here. Where in the passage? Well, I'm kind of highlighted here in the orange color. So this is kind of where we need to begin. However, keep in mind, an inference question may require us to really go back and read before and most likely after. And as I kind of scan through the information, I kind of think about, well, where does it mention obsidian itself? So again, looking throughout the paragraph, we need to decide, do I need to keep reading all of it? It's a possibility. So first, think about the information before and after it. So do we notice any signal words that might help us in connecting information? Well, I've highlighted a few here. First off, sometimes signals are not just referring to those types of directional words. Sometimes we could see a signal, it could be a repeated piece of information. So for example here, obsidian mining tells us to go back and look at this information. And then notice the words for example tells us that this is an example of something that was probably stated before. And then finally, I notice that after this sentence, I do see the signal all this. So it's most likely going to be this first part of the paragraph that I might want to focus on first. Now, is it possible I might need to read more? Well, that's possible. But this is probably the area where we want to begin. So in this case, we probably want to start with the sentence before it and figure out how does this part connect to that information. So we're just going to focus on that part of the reading that connects to the idea of obsidian. So I've kind of removed some of the last part of the paragraph, and now we're just going to look at this first part of the paragraph. Now let's go ahead and do that active reading process again. We really want to make sure we understand what the paragraph is telling us before we actually try to answer the question. So if you remember, this is something that we did not do when we first saw the text at the very beginning. This is something we're doing only because the question is requiring us to do this. So once again, we're going to try to provide our translation of the information. We're going to think about the organization, and we're going to think about how we can paraphrase the information. Well, first off, I do see that the word is for example. Now, we've already mentioned that this is a history text, but this particular part of the text does not seem to be necessarily describing an historical event. It seems to be rather describing a particular idea, and that's oftentimes what we see when we see the words for example. So first off, this particular signal is telling us that it's an example of something that we saw before it. And then we see with the signal all this, once again, this is connecting to the information that came before it. So watch as we go along how we try to demonstrate in our own words what this information is telling us. Well, so first off, I'm going to keep it in the same order for just a minute. So we've been talking about Teotihuacan. It's a traditional story, and it's talking about the positive connection among these different industries, like obsidian mining and working, trade, population growth, irrigation, and religious tourism. So I see the words positive feedback. So in other words, a feedback is when all of these particular things are connected to each other in some way. They help give positive connections among each other. Sort of giving each other some help, so to speak. Now, an example of this type of connection is what happens with the obsidian operation. Now, as I keep reading, I see that it says it necessitates more miners. It also necessitates additional manufacturers of the tools and additional traders to carry these goods to new markets. Well, if you think about it, it's describing kind of a process. The situation needed more workers, which required more tools. I mean, if you have more workers, you need more tools, right? And then, of course, as you produce more product, you need more traders to sell that product. So it does seem that in this case, the example it's providing is actually giving us an idea of a process. Well, you see, that's because there are some other signals that we need to pay attention to. Notice, for example, it says and. It says additional. It says more. So even these particular signals, these particular content words can signal to us that it's creating more and more and additional things, a process of a sense. And finally, when it says all this, well, what is this referring to? Well, again, this is referring to that thriving obsidian operation. And again, the word thriving here means successful. So in this case, this successful process made more money. It said it led to increased wealth. And of course, in turn, attracted more immigrants to the area, which we could say it brought more people from other places. So again, notice as this dynamic process, we're working, we're going back to the text, we're trying to figure out in more detail how these words kind of work together. So now that we can see from our translation, the real emphasis of the text is talking about how all of these things work together. They produce this kind of process that creates more success among the different industries, or industries related to obsidian operation. So, as we compare, now let's think about comparing the information from the paragraph, and again, just that part of the paragraph, to the answer stem itself, again, from the question. Because the idea here is now we want to connect information and figure out why exactly did the author mention this thriving obsidian operation. So, let's go through first and eliminate the choices that we think are not correct. First off, does it explain why manufacturing was the main industry of Teotihuacan? Well, nowhere in the text does it say that manufacturing was the main industry. In fact, it actually mentions that manufacturing or something like it was only part of this process. There seemed to also be trade and religious tourism. So in this case, it's probably not explaining why it's the main industry, but it is explaining that it's an important industry. So why don't we keep this one just for a moment? Okay, B, it gives an example of an industry that took very little time to develop. Well, it is interesting to see that it talked about that it was a positive situation. But notice as I look at the rest of the text, it doesn't necessarily talk about how much time it took to develop. In this case, we could certainly think this is possible, but we can't prove it from the text. Okay, let's move on to C. It illustrates how several factors influenced each other to make Teotihuacan a powerful and wealthy city. Well, it did mention that there were several factors, and notice that obsidian was only one example of them. And how these particular factors worked together. If you remember, we drew our little process, or a little, kind of this little circle here to indicate how the process kind of influenced each other. So C definitely seems to be one that we should keep. All right, finally, let's look at D. Can we explain how a successful industry can be a source of wealth and a source of conflict at the same time? Well, certainly the first part of the question is correct. It was a source of wealth. But I did not notice any negative language, and even if you go back to the rest of the text, we don't necessarily see that it mentions that there was a particular conflict. Now, once again, this might be possible, but it doesn't state it in the text. So at this point, we're going to eliminate D as well. So again, notice in the process of elimination, we're going to try to eliminate 2 answer choices and then give ourselves 2 choices to make. Okay, so now we compare A and C. Which one seems to be the better answer choice? Well, once again in A, we notice there was a problem. Manufacturing is not the main industry. At least we don't know that. It doesn't mention it anywhere that manufacturing was the main industry. It was an important one, certainly, and definitely helped lead to a lot of increased wealth. But it doesn't necessarily state that it was the main industry. Whereas in C, it does seem to reflect the idea of the signals given in the text. That it was additional information that produced more tools and produced more traders, so producing this kind of cycle or process. So in this case, it seems that C is probably our best answer choice. And remember, the correct answer is probably going to be very similar to the language that we saw in the text, which in this case it is. But remember, answer choices that may use the exact same language, or ones that misrepresent the idea of the text, those are probably going to be wrong. And remember, don't choose what is possible, choose what you can prove. So now some final thoughts. Inference questions ask you to draw a conclusion based on the information presented in the text. But type 3 inference questions, remember, they also ask you to find the answer choice that uses basically the same idea, but with similar or synonymous language instead of words that may exactly be the same. Type 4, or the infer rhetorical purpose questions, also ask you to think about the author's purpose in choosing a particular wording or fact. But as we learned in the video, it also means finding the answer choice that uses basically the same idea, but with similar or synonymous language. The tricks we learned in this particular video, again, a lot of the same tricks you'll see throughout the test. Using answer choices that may contain exact wording. Using answer choices that get some of the information correct, but not all of it. And using answer choices that misrepresent the information or get the order of the information wrong. We also learned an important process of helping us improve our reading and understanding on the test. And this is a process we will come back to again and again in the remaining videos of this series. Active reading is a process that becomes especially important as we try to understand more and more text. Remember, with inference questions, we're going to have to read more information. So we have to be able to completely comprehend the text in order to make the correct conclusion we need. Remember that active reading involves the following things. Trying to understand the organization of the text by looking for signal words, and often these are signals we associate with specific academic reading. So for example, we saw today that time signals and sequence signals are very common in history texts, which often use that chronological or sequential fashion and organization. Paraphrasing information is another part of the process. It's where we try to simplify the language into words we can understand, often eliminating unnecessary words or ideas if possible. Of course, this could be a problem. What if we don't know all of the words in the text or understand them? Well, then you have a problem. We also know that active reading can involve reordering information. Sometimes it's helpful to move texts around in order to better understand the connections that are being made. So again, this is not always necessary, but sometimes it might be helpful to get you more active in the process. So just recall that this is dynamic. We always continually are working with the text and performing sometimes these three functions all at the same time. Sometimes we don't really understand the organization until we've worked with it a lot. So keep in mind, all of these particular things can occur at the same time, and oftentimes we might go back in different parts of the sequence to better understand them. Once again, I find it helpful to remind you that there's lots of good information out there to help you prepare for the TOEFL test. So we'll see you next time for Part 4, Vocabulary and Reference Questions. Thanks for watching.